Hello, and welcome to this podcast of the Florida Historical Society. I'm Holly Baker, podcast producer for the University of Central Florida's History Department. Today's podcast features an interview with Dr. Robert Krause, an architectural historian and a disaster response specialist who works in Houston, Texas. Dr. Krause wrote an article in the summer 2018 issue of the Florida Historical Quarterly Journal called New Deal Public Works in the Florida Panhandle, 1933 to 1940. Have a listen to our conversation. I will start off by just asking you to tell me about yourself and what you do.
Well, I'm presently an architectural historian and disaster response specialist for Search, headquartered in Orlando. I head up the Houston office for our firm, 25, almost 30 years in business now. And we do the full range of cultural resource management projects, which means I have really a chance to have my hat in a lot of different ranks, which is kind of part of my background as an interdisciplinary person. Environmental history and preservation were very important to me early on in my career and still are. So I basically started I went to undergrad at the University of Mississippi. In the summer of 2001, I took an internship with the National Park Service and worked at Horseshoe Bend National Military Park in Daviston, Alabama, Tallapoosa County, if you're familiar. And it's a War of 1812 site, essentially one of Andrew Jackson's most sweeping victories. But we did a lot of interpretive work there and then kind of moved on to do historic house curation and historic preservation in Virginia, and I worked for the Florida SHPO under Scott Stroh, and helped with the restoration of the Grove in Tallahassee. That was my first project after my dissertation was completed in 2010. So finished my PhD at Ole Miss under Charles Wilson in 2010. And part of my article, this is my article for the Florida Historical Quarterly, was essentially half of my dissertation. The other half focused on TVA in Northeast Mississippi. And so I ended up working at the Florida SHPO as a tax credit reviewer and historian and restoration specialist there. Did a bunch of different things there. Went on to work in local government as a preservationist in Northern Virginia and for the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. Worked there for 4 years as a preservationist. Decided to move into the private sector in 2017. Worked with Ardura Incorporated. They are a mostly water engineering firm here in Houston. Worked with the Texas General Land Office on several different community development block grant programs, which is my first entree into disaster work. I had administered some grant works with Hurricane Sandy in Maryland, but had a chance to be the lead environmental and cultural review for 2 storm events in South Carolina from 2015, and then did work with the city of Houston after Hurricane Harvey, and continued that work now. 2018, I took a job. I actually came on board at Graham Pape to head up their disaster response campaign, and had some good success there. Started a contract with the city of Houston for housing infrastructure rebuild, and had a chance to join Search and really expand the vision of the disaster response beyond regionally to the entire U.S. and really beyond. We do work in the South Pacific, and but yeah, the New Deal and particularly the public works angles and the buildings, it's really it remains important to me and instructive in a lot of ways.
That's awesome. So I would like to know more about your article in the Florida Historical Quarterly from summer 2018. It's volume 97, number 1. I have always been intrigued by the New Deal programs under the Roosevelt administration. And I saw your article, New Deal Public Works in the Florida Panhandle, 1933 to 1940. Something about the Great Depression, the early 1900s, I've always been drawn to the history of that time. Please tell me more. How did the New Deal agencies impact the human and natural landscapes in Florida's Panhandle?
Well, they New Deal Public Works, and really what we mean by that are any federally funded projects that change both the human and environmental space during the New Deal period. And they fall under, of course, the alphabet agencies, the blanket of those. And really, the New Deal Public Works, and especially in places like Florida and in Mississippi, they usher in a period of tremendous economic social and political change. And that's one of the many kind of reminders of that, of the transformation really of the natural environment and the human-built environment in the early 20th century in places that certainly were still raw in terms of their forest resources. And I would argue that New Deal works really helped to transform Florida, especially in the Panhandle of Florida, from primarily agricultural, market-related economy to one that is more in line with the rest of the state, as being driven towards service and tourism. A lot of the beach dredging programs in the 1930s speak to that in Panama City and places along the Panhandle coast. And along the similar lines, the Resettlement Administration was one of the agencies critical to environmental change, as were the CCC, so Civilian Conservation Corps, and the WPA. The Resettlement Administration, especially important in Florida because people were actively being moved off of what they call the marginal land onto maybe better courses of land elsewhere nearby, within a 10-mile radius usually. And Resettlement Administration was a short-lived manifestation of, I think, a well-intended outreach program that really, and some revolutionary science emerges from studies in ecology and botany in the establishment of the Florida State Parks. So there's quite a bit of legacy there in terms of the New Deal in Florida.
Looking through here, your article, you have a lot of different examples of projects that took place. And I wonder if there's any ones that you'd like to highlight.
I think I'll kind of reiterate a point earlier. The establishment of the Florida State Park system is really driven by the CCC and their efforts on the ground throughout the state. I think the Florida State Parks were most notably a new presence and visible presence in the Panhandle. So you have places like Florida Caverns being actually surveyed by CCC crews, and the first tourism in Defuniak Springs, and in that area, extreme Northwest Florida. And it's ushering in this kind of, also alongside the commercial aspects of this, the science piece, the scientific piece, revolutionary kind of science that's emerging from this on ecology and botany in places like Torreya Pines State Park in Gadsden County. And I think this speaks to the sort of utilitarian appreciation that New Deal had for environmental facets and in the natural environment. Another way that you see this manifest is in municipal and local construction projects. And really, throughout the state, I think you could argue that similar today, south of Ocala, a lot of those municipal local construction projects were built on existing facilities, whereas in the Panhandle, particularly in counties that were majority African-American like Gadsden and Washington, you had a situation where there were no facilities to begin with. So schools were built, swing sets were built, recreational equipment, and boat docks, marinas were transformed. So this had a very wide-ranging impact on the local economy, particularly in places that to us would appear much more isolated than they are even now. Many of the roads and bridges we traverse to get to Panama City or Apalachicola didn't exist then. And the New Deal infrastructure allows those things to happen in the 1950s with the National Highway Program. Port of Pensacola is another good example of really an improvement. I think they put $2.5 million, $2.7 million into rebuilding, and that's 1930s money, rebuilding the Port of Pensacola entirely, and allows that to become a deep water channel port. So really revolutionary for folks in Escambia County. That would also help the military installations in that area grow, along with the sort of municipal infrastructure, sidewalks that allow for what we see as the sort of suburbanization of places across Florida. So to me, the New Deal and these basically construction projects changed the face of Florida as markedly as anywhere else in the country, I think you could argue. So that, but in some ways, New Deal Public Works and really the New Deal legislation that's passed is monolithic in some ways, because change doesn't happen for women. Change doesn't happen for African Americans for the most part. There's marginal sort of infrastructure improvements in Black communities, but nothing reaching close to equal rights or increased access to resources for women as well. And, I think women's role in the WPA and the CCC in Florida is really an understudied dimension that I think it would be really interesting to take on too.
I definitely realized that I was thinking about this, and of course reading your article about how the state of tourism that we have now wouldn't have probably been possible without all of these New Deal public works that took place. Like you say, the roads and the construction and the buildings and the state parks definitely allowed for the state to become the big tourism mecca that it became by the 1950s.
Absolutely, and really the beach dredging projects that were taken on by the Corps and also by CCC, and the Bureau of Reclamation was very active in Florida, whereas it was primarily active in Western states at that time. So much federal land in Florida allowed the Bureau of Reclamation, Land Reclamation, to assist in beach dredging activities. And not only that, but like the inshore or wetland systems of inshore bays in Florida, in the Florida Panhandle, were really transformed by this, by projects that helped with erosion and combated some of the environmental issues that before then were not really able to be addressed sufficiently. Advances in agricultural medicine that are part of the tick and cholera program, the eradication of tick and cholera, the attempted eradication of that amongst pig farms and cattle ranches in Florida. This was a mandatory program, and the records are quite extensive for about 15 years of vaccination records across the state. And what we see is this kind of mainlining of agricultural market services into kind of alignment with the rest of the state. In this similar way that you saw the beaches and the development of hotels. Now the Panhandle had always been known as a place where there was entertainment. There are actually multiple letters to Dave Schultz, governor, during the New Deal, expressing people's concern for lawlessness and licentiousness happening on offshore and in places like Panama City. So I think that the tourism economy in North Florida kind of catches up in some ways. The infrastructure is there for it to be able to catch up a bit to counterparts in South Florida. So one example of the use of public money to improve the infrastructure of the New Deal period in Florida was the Good Roads program. And this was really a program that started actually in South Florida as a federally funded program. It had $12 million in funding in 1930 to roughly $54 million 4 or 5 years later by 1935. So you're talking about a program that was successful almost immediately. It predates the Interstate Highway program, so famous, developed by Dwight Eisenhower. But the impact of the National Good Roads program wasn't relegated to South Florida. And what became the Gulf Coast Highway gained an impressive new bridge. The Gorey Bridge opened to traffic in 1935, and that allowed Apalachicola to become connected with the rest of Florida. And the federal money in Calhoun County actually completed a major long-span steel bridge over the Apalachicola River near Bluntstown that I believe is still in use. It was constructed by the Wisconsin Bridge and Iron Company and opened in 1938. And it was one of those road and bridge construction projects in the Panhandle that fueled growth and the development really of that the industrial military complex in the region, in places like Eglin Air Force Base and a lot of the other military installations in the Panhandle that are developed from 1950 to 1990. So the road building project really has an impact across the state, but I would argue that counties like Bay County, Escambia, Franklin County, those road building projects were really transformative and led to also the integration of car culture in the 1930s and 40s too. So.
I want to ask one last question, just to kind of like wrap it all up. But what do you think is the legacy of the New Deal public works?
I think that one of the legacies, or to really assess the impact of the New Deal and these public works, you really have to go to the local level. State statistics are great, but to look at a place like Washington County in the northwest corner of the Panhandle, those road building projects under the CWA and FERA, under Schultz, Dave Schultz again, really marked the transformation of upland swamps and really flat woods areas. And so you have a real overhauling of the landscape in a way that the construction of bridges, canals, highways, roads, they're the physical legacies, the things that we still see today, but really access to resources, the lasting impact of New Deal activity in Florida and maybe even across the nation broadly, where African American communities are built essentially from the ground using federal money for the first time, and new access to economic pathways for people living in the rural South, which is exactly what the Panhandle was at that time. And, in Florida specifically, the transformation of our waterways is a very meaningful and obviously contested impact of the New Deal. The intercoastal waterway comes about because of the National Recovery Administration. And that's obviously a critical connection that Florida has to the rest of the United States and to the world through the economic market of the world. So there are those very localized impacts that remain today, and the sort of broader patterns that do as well.
Well, thank you so much.
Oh, you bet, Holly. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to talking to you again.
That was Dr. Robert Krause talking about his article in the summer 2018 issue of the Florida Historical Quarterly Journal called New Deal Public Works in the Florida Panhandle, 1933 to 1940. Thank you for joining our international audience for this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly Journal. The Florida Historical Quarterly is the peer-reviewed scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in Florida. The Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the journal are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast and that you will consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. Thank you again for listening to the Florida Historical Quarterly Podcast.